It began with the wind, not a storm or a gale, but a steady, whispering force that had been known for generations by sailors and storytellers alike, the monsoon, a seasonal breath of the Indian Ocean that didn't just carry rain or clouds, it carried people, and cargo, and dreams. And for Roman traders standing at the edge of the Red Sea, gazing east toward lands they'd never seen, that wind was a promise, because every July, when the winds turned, ships unfurled their sails in the harbors of Meos Hormos and Berenice, loaded with jars of wine, rolls of cloth, polished glassware, and hopes thicker than the heat rising from the sand. They knew they were setting out not just on a voyage, but on a transformation, one that would take them thousands of miles across unfamiliar seas to a world bursting with color, scent, and strange names whispered in marketplaces back home. The first leg was long but familiar, a 700-mile glide down the Gulf of Aden to Ocelis, an Arabian port that wasn't really a city, more of a watery comma in the sentence of the sea, a place to rest, fill barrels with fresh water, patch sails, say a few prayers, and then look southeast to where the real journey began. For centuries, Greek and Roman sailors had hugged the coastline, cautious and slow, following every inlet like a finger tracing the edge of a map, but that changed when someone, perhaps a man named Hippalos, realized the sea itself had rhythm. That the winds could carry you straight across the ocean if only you trusted them, and so they did, pushing past the comfort of land, into the deep water, letting the monsoon hurl them east at 40 to 60 miles per hour, riding waves as high as houses, across a sea as unpredictable as it was essential. And for 70 days they sailed, eyes squinting at the horizon, counting stars at night, hoping they were still on course, driven by the knowledge that if they timed it right, they'd arrive on the Indian coast in early September, just before the winds shifted again, and once there, they had 2 months, only 2, to trade, to barter, to gather silks and spices, gems and incense, before the return winds began in November and the whole ocean turned against them. These voyages were not for the faint of heart. They were planned not in months, but in breaths, in tides, in timing, and as the ships neared the coast of India, the sea itself began to change, the color lightening near the Indus Delta, where the great river poured fresh water into the salt, changing the hue of the water and filling it with life. A clue to the seasoned pilots that land was near. And when they finally reached Barbaricon, a port at the mouth of the Indus, they weren't just 3,000 miles from home, they were standing at the gates of a civilization as ancient and structured as their own, a place with its own kings, laws, gods, and ambitions. This wasn't a Roman province. This was Indo-Parthia, a land where merchants weren't just tolerated, they were studied, monitored, taxed, and guided through a network of bureaucracy that would have made any Roman official proud. And it was here, on this stretch of river, beneath foreign banners and incense-thick air, that Roman merchants began one of the most lucrative and surprising relationships in ancient history, not with swords or governors, but with glass beads, red coral, amphorae of wine, and the ever-turning wheel of the monsoon. Because this wasn't just trade. It was the beginning of a dialogue, one written not in treaties, but in wind. When Roman ships finally reached the mouth of the Indus, they were met not by wild shores or nameless tribes, but by structure, by a system, by a world that knew exactly how to handle strangers bearing goods, because this was not some forgotten corner of the map, this was Indo-Parthia. A land of ancient cities and organized power, where trade wasn't a transaction but a ceremony, a ritual played out at the water's edge under watchful eyes and tall banners fluttering in the humid breeze. The first true port was Barbaricon, a dusty river harbor that sat like a sentinel on the frontier of Indo-Parthian power, a gateway not just to a region, but to a way of life built on regulation, protocol, and the quiet understanding that everything, every bead of coral, every bolt of cloth, every breath of cinnamon-scented air, had value. As Roman goods were unloaded onto the docks, they passed into the hands of the Antipala, the officer of boundaries, a man whose seal carried weight greater than any handshake, because before a Roman merchant could climb into his boat or onto his ox cart to travel inland, his cargo had to be verified, catalogued, and taxed, not once, but twice, as if the land itself needed to take a breath before it welcomed foreign wares into its heart. Stamped and approved, the goods were then ferried up the Indus toward the beating center of southern Indo-Parthia, Minigar, a city that pulsed with color and calculation, where traders from Persia, Central Asia, and even China gathered beneath carved stone archways to argue, laugh, drink, and make fortunes on words alone. Here, another official waited, the superintendent of tolls, stationed beneath a distinctive banner that told all who approached, "This is where we watch, this is where we record, and this is where your paperwork must match what you said it was 300 miles ago." His staff would document everything: who you were, where your ship had come from, how much cargo you carried, where you first received your customs seal, and every line was compared, every number tallied, not out of suspicion, but because this was a world that valued order as much as it valued trade. And there was beauty in that order, a kind of ancient precision that showed how deeply Indo-Parthian civilization understood the risks and rewards of opening itself to the world. It wasn't xenophobia, it was stewardship. It was protection. And in many ways, it mirrored Rome's own obsession with infrastructure, control, and the rule of law. So, the Romans adapted. They learned to speak the local languages of protocol. They waited in long lines behind merchants from Sogdia and Persia. They paid the fees. They accepted the stamps. And in return, they gained access to one of the most vibrant trade networks in the Eastern world, a system that stretched from the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea, from Bactria to Bengal. They brought their glassware, their silver, their coral, their coin, and found in return not just buyers, but a rhythm, a way of doing business that was at once foreign and familiar. And in that, something remarkable began to form, something more than exchange. It was trust. It was structure. It was the foundation of a relationship not built on emperors or conquests, but on ink, grain, spice, and seal. And it began right there, at the gates of the Indus, where Rome stepped into India, not as a conqueror, but as a guest. By the time Roman merchants reached Minigar, their cargo had already been inspected, catalogued, sealed, and taxed, but the real business was only just beginning, because this was where luxury truly came alive, in the heart of Indo-Parthian India. Where the air was thick with spice and the streets shimmered with the colors of goods that had traveled farther than most men ever would. Minigar was not just a city, it was a marketplace of empires, a place where deals were made in half a dozen languages, where coins from Rome clinked against gemstones from Kashmir, and where the scent of Arabian incense curled between bolts of Chinese silk and baskets of Himalayan herbs. Roman glass was a prized treasure here, its clarity and craftsmanship unmatched, admired by Indian elites who had only known their own heavy, cloudy glass until now, and they marveled at the way Roman vessels caught the sunlight, how they seemed almost weightless, like holding a piece of sky. Red coral, too, was more than decoration, it was sacred, powerful, believed to ward off poison and evil, and it wasn't just worn on wrists and necks, it was written into the Arthashastra itself as something to be stockpiled alongside pearls and diamonds in the royal treasury. And when Roman traders unwrapped bundles of the precious Mediterranean coral from their cargo, they weren't just offering a product, they were offering magic. These weren't casual exchanges. This was a carefully engineered machine of value and control. Indo-Parthian officials managed the trade not with chaos, but with precision, ensuring that the rarest goods, like peridot gemstones, storax perfumes, and silver tableware, were recorded, taxed, and sold through regulated channels that funneled wealth directly into the hands of rulers. Private gem dealers were forbidden from bringing stones into certain cities unless authorized, meaning that foreign merchants had to go through state agents, had to pay state prices, and had to accept that trade in this world was not free, it was curated. And it worked. It turned ports like Minigar into treasure hubs, into places where Roman coins melted into the economy, where imperial wealth turned into Eastern luxury, and where even a simple transaction was part of something larger. This wasn't just about economics. This was a moment in time when trade became the language of diplomacy, when regulation became a form of power, and when Roman merchants found themselves not in opposition to the Indian state, but woven into it, moving along lines of law and logic that matched their own. Because while these civilizations may have worshipped different gods, while their maps were drawn from opposite ends of the world, they both understood the same truth: control meant survival, and order meant prosperity. And so, For every gemstone wrapped in silk, for every goblet of Roman glass handed over to a Saka noble, there was also a form, a seal, a record, a quiet affirmation that even across oceans, civilizations could recognize each other not through conquest, but through rules, respect, and the shared hunger for beauty. In Minigar, the power of empire wasn't on display in swords, it was in scales and ledgers, in trade halls and tolls, in the way luxury was managed with the same care as a military campaign. And in that space, Rome and India didn't just trade goods, they traded identities, weaving themselves into each other's stories, one coral bead, one carved gem, one silent signature at a time. If Minigar was the door to Indo-Parthian trade, then Ujjain was the engine behind it, a city deep in the heart of the Indian subcontinent, pulsing with color, culture, and commerce, where rare goods didn't just appear by chance, they were curated, taxed, polished, and prepared like royal offerings before being sent west toward the sea, and from there into the waiting hands of the Roman world. Ujjain wasn't just a city, it was a collector, a funnel, a center of gravity for one of the most elaborate trade operations in the ancient world, where everything from silk yarn to lapis lazuli, from costus root to cotton cloth, was gathered as tribute, measured by weight and worth, and then dispatched in caravans to the bustling port of Baragaza, 200 miles to the southwest, along dusty roads worn smooth by centuries of trade, guarded by men who knew that every wagon held not just goods, but the weight of economic strategy. In Ujjain, the Saka kings had turned trade into an art of control, forbidding independent dealers from handling certain commodities, ensuring that the most precious items, gems, perfumes, rare crops, could only be sold by state agents, agents whose profits flowed directly into the royal treasury, making commerce not a private venture, but an extension of governance itself. From Ujjain, bales of cloth were packed with onyx and agate, layered with silks and stones, spices and incense, and sent along predetermined paths to Baragaza, a river port tucked 30 miles inland from the Indian Ocean, where Roman ships waited, their deep hulls straining at the docks, ready to take these treasures back across the sea. But reaching Baragaza wasn't easy. The Nirmada River's currents were unpredictable, the sandbanks treacherous, and the port itself vulnerable to foreign ships unfamiliar with local tides, so the Saka rulers solved the problem not with fortresses, but with boats, small, local rowing vessels sent out to guide Roman freighters upriver. A royal service paid for by the merchants themselves and administered with precision. This wasn't hospitality. This was policy. It was a way to manage risk, to keep the Roman presence controlled, to make sure that what entered the city passed not just through water but through will. Once docked, Roman traders unloaded amphorae of wine, both from Italy and from Laodicea in Asia Minor, along with copper and tin, plain clothing, printed fabrics, and above all, the gleaming red coral that seemed to cast a spell over the region. In return, they received cargoes of cotton, silk, ivory, spices, turquoise, and dazzling gemstones that Rome could never produce in such beauty or quantity, stones that would end up in the earrings of elite Roman women, set into drinking cups, or carved into rings worn by senators eager to prove that wealth had no border. And all of this, the gems, the cloth, the coral, the wine, was recorded, weighed, taxed, and monitored by a system that treated trade like military logistics, a machine that ran not on conquest, but on calculation. The trade between Rome and India was not random. It was a system, a rhythm, a choreography of ports and cities, of rivers and routes, of kings and customs officers, all working together in silent, strategic harmony. And in the spaces between each transaction, something bigger was happening. Rome and India weren't just exchanging goods, they were aligning systems, blending priorities, learning, without ever saying it, that greatness isn't always about borders and battles. Sometimes it's about knowing how to move the right things, to the right places, at the right time. Somewhere in the heart of the Roman Empire, perhaps in a sunlit courtyard near the Palatine Hill or beneath the painted ceiling of a marble atrium, the Emperor Augustus received a gift he never expected, not tribute from a defeated people, not scrolls of law or maps of conquest, but a wild Himalayan pheasant with iridescent feathers, a boy from India with one arm, and a tiger, living, breathing, pacing softly across the stones of Rome, and behind them, walking with quiet purpose, a monk, perhaps Jain or Buddhist, sent not to conquer minds, but to open them. This was not the march of empire, it was the whisper of wonder. The emissaries came from the Indo-Scythian Saka kings, rulers of the western edge of India who had ridden in from the steppes and carved out a domain rich in trade, full of ports, silk, and power, and as the Parthians pushed eastward, threatening their hold on the region. The Sakas looked west and saw a possible savior in Rome. They had heard of the empire across the sea, of its strength, its victories, its long memory of conflict with Parthia, and in their eyes, perhaps they saw an opportunity, a pincer from two sides, a silent handshake over the mountains. So they sent embassies in 26 BC and again in 22 BC, bearing gifts and messages, letters written in Greek and sealed by King Aesus himself, letters that asked for alliance, for friendship, for a shared cause against a mutual threat. But Rome, ever careful, was in the process of making peace with the Parthians, and Augustus, cautious as he was curious, declined the military offer but agreed to a treaty of friendship, and what might have been a campaign became instead a connection. The monk who came with them stayed in Rome, not as an ambassador, but as a presence, a quiet voice from a world Rome barely understood, and though his request to build a religious shrine was denied, his presence itself said more than stone ever could. Imagine the conversations he might have had, the questions, the misunderstandings, the moments of shared silence between two civilizations who had met not through war but through wonder. These embassies, these gifts, these moments, they didn't redraw maps or shift power, but they whispered something deeper, that even across the vastness of the ancient world, people were trying to reach each other, to understand, to send a tiger and a monk in place of a sword. And if Rome was surprised by the gifts, India too must have wondered at the empire that accepted them, that measured friendship in letters and silence instead of marching legions. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was a moment of reflection between giants, a rare glimpse of mutual curiosity in an age usually defined by conquest. In these quiet offerings, in these strange, beautiful moments of cultural encounter, we find a deeper truth, that sometimes the greatest journeys in history are not measured in battles won, but in boundaries crossed with open hands. In the willingness to send a part of your world to stand in the court of another and say, "We see you, we hear of you, and we wonder what we might become, if we listen." For all the wonder and ceremony, all the coral and incense and shimmering gems passing between ports, there was something else flowing quietly in the background of this great maritime exchange, something less colorful, less poetic, but far more powerful, a river of silver. Flowing east from Rome with every transaction, with every cargo hold emptied into Indian markets and every treasure packed back into Roman ships, because while the empire may have stood tall with its roads, its armies, its architecture, it had one deep vulnerability that grew with every successful voyage: it could not match the East in goods of equal value. Rome exported wine, glass, metal, coral, sometimes textiles, and though these items were admired, even coveted, they could not compete with the Indian subcontinent's endless offerings, spices so rare they became currency, gemstones that rivaled anything found in the West, fine cotton, silk, dyes, perfumes, incense, medicinal herbs, things that changed not just fashion but ritual, that became woven into Roman identity itself. And so, when the bartering ended and the ledgers balanced, what remained was simple: silver, Roman denarii by the thousands, and sometimes gold ore, handed over not just as payment, but as necessity, as the price of access to a world Rome couldn't replicate. The Saka kings knew this. The Indo-Parthians knew it. Indian traders knew it. They saw the steady trickle of precious metal pouring into their treasuries, and they made sure the system kept feeding it. Roman merchants were often encouraged, or required, to exchange their imperial currency into local coin before conducting business, and though it looked like a courtesy, the truth was sharper: Indian currency often lacked precious metal. While Roman coins were minted from solid gold and high-purity silver, so the exchange was never equal, always in favor of the host. Some of these Roman coins didn't just circulate, they vanished, melted down, turned into new issues bearing Saka kings' faces, stamped with new symbols but made from Roman veins. And modern metallurgical analysis confirms what those ancient merchants never knew for certain: that silver minted in Rome ended its life as money in India. King Nahapana, one of the most efficient of the Saka rulers, oversaw this transformation deliberately, issuing coins with a higher silver content thanks to this influx of Roman metal, reinforcing his kingdom's economy, stabilizing his control, and in doing so, turning Roman wealth into Indian strength. For the Roman Empire, the consequences were long-term, invisible at first, a slow leak in a mighty reservoir, but over decades and centuries, that river of silver mattered. It contributed to the gradual depletion of bullion reserves in the West, to inflation, to economic strain that no trade surplus could reverse, because you cannot balance a ledger when your wealth is being turned into someone else's currency. And yet, the Romans kept coming. The trade routes kept growing. The value of Eastern goods, real, symbolic, and emotional, was simply too high. Indian gems became staples of Roman fashion, silks draped over senators' wives, incense burned in temples and homes, spices flavored the kitchens of emperors and merchants alike, and the silver kept flowing. This is the paradox of ancient trade, not war, not conquest, but quiet economic surrender, a subtle shift of power masked by the sound of coins changing hands. And while Rome never lost its grandeur overnight, never fell because of a single cause, the river of silver running eastward through Barbaricon and Baragaza was one of the currents that pulled at the foundations. It is a reminder that history is not just written in battles or borders, but in transactions, in trade winds, in the weight of a coin passed from one hand to another and never returned. If you looked closely at the fabric of empire, not the marble, not the legions, not the statues of emperors or the towers of kings, but the fabric itself, the literal threads, the garments people wore, the gemstones they strung into necklaces, the spices they ground into meals, the perfumes they dabbed onto their skin, you would find the story of Rome and India not written in laws or battles, but woven into color and scent and texture, because between these two ancient worlds there was never a treaty, never a war, no shared border or official alliance. Yet they moved each other deeply, silently, through trade, through fascination, through the movement of ships riding monsoons and merchants climbing dusty hills, and in every box unloaded at a Roman port or unsealed at a dock in Baragaza, there was more than just product, there was imagination. Longing, admiration for a culture half a world away that you might never see but somehow already believed in. Rome sent its glass, its coral, its wine, its silver, but what came back changed how Romans dressed, how they decorated their homes, how they scented their temples and cleansed their bodies, and in turn, Indian courts collected foreign metals, recoined them with local pride, wore Roman glass like divine decoration, and treated Mediterranean coral as something magical, something worthy of kings and priests, and in all of this, in every object passed hand to hand, what was really being exchanged was meaning. We talk about power as if it only comes from armies or from land, but there's a different kind of power in trade, a soft, subtle power that doesn't conquer through force, but through desire, that reshapes a culture from within, one luxury at a time, one habit at a time. Until the idea of the other becomes part of your own identity, and Rome, for all its military glory, became something more through these exchanges, more colorful, more perfumed, more global in the quietest of ways. The Indo-Parthian officials stamping cargo, the Saka kings controlling gems, the Roman captains steering their ships with prayers and star charts, all of them were part of something bigger than themselves, a web of movement, ambition, regulation, and risk that made the world feel just a little smaller, a little more connected, and in that connection was something close to diplomacy, something close to peace. This wasn't just trade, it was communication, it was art, it was empire meeting empire not by sword, but by silk. And though time would bury many of these routes, those cities would fall and ports would shift and names like Minagar and Ujjain would fade from the tongues of everyday people, their impact didn't disappear, it lived on in habits, in styles, in the silver that still rests beneath Indian soil and the colored stones that still shine in Roman ruins. The empires are gone, but the thread remains. It reminds us that even in a divided world, connection is always possible, not just across oceans or mountains, but across belief, across language, across fear. It reminds us that when people choose to trade instead of fight, when they send a cargo ship instead of a warship, they leave behind more than wealth, they leave behind a legacy of shared humanity, subtle and strong, like silk stretched across centuries.